I was still protecting our future, while she was already quietly designing a version of life where I no longer existed in it. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. Loyalty can become dangerous when it is one-sided long enough. I did not understand that at first. I thought loyalty meant patience, consistency, and the willingness to keep showing up even when a relationship felt strained. I was proud of that part of myself. It felt like integrity. What I did not realize is that integrity becomes self-harm when you keep offering it to someone who is using your steadiness as cover while planning their exit. Hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. She became cold in strategic ways, not dramatic enough to force a confrontation, just distant enough to wear me down. She asked strange questions about finances, future housing, and how I would manage if certain routines changed. She became secretive with documents, passwords, and phone calls. At the time, I thought she was stressed. Later, I realized she was rehearsing separation, while still benefiting from the emotional and practical security my loyalty gave her every day. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience, rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The truth arrived through a document she left half open on the computer. It looked like an ordinary spreadsheet until I recognized references to rent estimates, timelines, legal notes, and a list of steps that only made sense if she was preparing to leave me while keeping her own transition as smooth as possible. I sat there reading that file in disbelief because it was so clean, so calm, and so practical. She had turned the end of our relationship into a project plan before I even knew the project existed. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt. Yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped. My breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. After that, every hidden detail sharpened. There were conversations with friends I had never seen, apartment links, emotional messages with someone new, and notes about how to time everything so I would be least disruptive to her image and convenience. That was the part that broke me hardest. Not only that she wanted out, but that she wanted to stage manage my pain so it would interfere with her life as little as possible. It is one thing to fall out of love. It is another thing to make someone else's devastation part of your logistics. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. I kept thinking about the nights I had stayed up reassuring her when she seemed anxious, the extra shifts I took when money was tight, the plans I kept making under the assumption that we were still a team. Loyalty had made me vulnerable, yes, but it had not made me foolish. What made her behavior so ugly was that she understood my loyalty clearly enough to depend on it while preparing to discard it. She was counting on my decency while operating without any of her own. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually, there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. When I confronted her, she did not deny the planning. She denied the cruelty of the planning, which in some ways was more revealing. She called it practical. She said she needed to protect herself. She framed the secrecy as maturity, but maturity does not require emotional ambush. Protection does not require using someone until the replacement structure is complete. Her language could not hide the basic truth that she had been treating me like temporary scaffolding under a future she planned to build without me. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. After we separated, the story she had imagined did not unfold as neatly as her document suggested. Life rarely obeys spreadsheets when the foundations are dishonesty and emotional opportunism. The new connection she had leaned on proved fragile. The confidence she carried into the split did not translate into peace. I learned all of that later, but by then it mattered less than I thought it would. What mattered more was that I had finally seen the relationship clearly enough to stop romanticizing my own role inside it. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes: the paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. I rebuilt slowly, and in some ways the slow pace saved me. It forced me to distinguish between loyalty and passivity, between being loving and being available for exploitation. That distinction changed every relationship that came after. I no longer admire myself for how much pain I can quietly withstand. I admire myself for how quickly I move when respect disappears. That is a harder lesson, but a healthier one. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it, step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace. It began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. I stayed loyal while she planned to replace me, and for a while that made me feel humiliated. Now it makes me feel clear. My loyalty was real. Her planning was real. Only one of those things still lets me sleep at night. In the end, that matters more than who controlled the timing. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what truth will cost, or whether you will accept the cost and finally keep your own dignity intact. That choice is brutal. It is also where a real life starts again, and that is the part I wish more people understood. Betrayal is dramatic in the discovery, but its real meaning is revealed in what you do next. Do you go back to sleep emotionally because the truth is expensive, or do you let that truth reorganize your life around something cleaner? That question changed everything for me. If you have lived through something similar, then you already know the answer is never simple. But it is still worth saying out loud, because